Welcome to the fourth in the series of the policy dialogues we've been having on Zoom and on Facebook. Tonight, we are partnering with the South African Institute of International Affairs. And I'm pleased that we're working together with the SAIA. And welcome to Elizabeth, my colleague, who will be a panelist on this session. The session we're looking at today is the South Africa's policy towards Zimbabwe. Is it a case of the tail wagging the dog, indifference, incapacity, or harvesting on a neighbor's economic woes? That's a question before us. I was asked to explain what is meant by tail wagging the dog. It means really a situation in which a powerful factor, such as South Africa, appears to be controlled or unable to deal with a lesser quantity, such as Zimbabwe. Indifference, the word speaks for itself. Incapacity, the question is whether the South African state has capacity to deal with Zimbabwe. And lastly, whether South Africa is quite comfortable in the comfort of the fact that economically, Zimbabwe is very dependent on it. The balance of trade, for example, the number of Zimbabweans working skilled and unskilled in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So tonight, really, we have experts in the true sense of the word to deal with the topic. The first is Elizabeth Sideropoulos, the CEO of SAIA, expert on South African foreign policy, especially with respect to Africa and the region. We have Linda Freeman, Canadian. She's in Ottawa. Thanks, Linda, for joining us. She's a emeritus professor at Carleton. But Linda, I've known Linda since the 80s, went through the Canadian Political Science Association. So I'm glad to have connected. Thanks to David Moore, who put us in touch. Last but not least, we have Tendai Dumuchena, a Zimbabwean South African, who was work as a journalist, will of course inform the discussion, but also as one who has been a functionary in the government of South Africa for the last 2 decades in the various portfolios that he has been through. Of significance here is that we have Linda Freeman. She's doing a book entitled The Albatross of History, South Africa and Zimbabwe in the Mbeki years. And it would be interesting to hear the comparisons in terms of tackling the Zimbabwe situation between the Mbeki years, Zuma years, and of course the Ramaphosa years. We also have discussants. We've been engaged with the Zimbabwean South African situation. We have P.S. Pigu from the International Crisis Group, which a very renowned analyst on both Zimbabwe and South Africa. Matata Tsedu, a very senior journalist, renowned journalist in South Africa from the 80s already, and he will certainly give us some sound bites on the nature of the relationships between Zimbabwe and South Africa. Then we have Dumisani Mlea, a Zimbabwean, also a leading journalist, and an astute observer of the South Africa-Zimbabwe relations. And then we have Stephen Groost from SAIA. He is head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at SAIA. And last but not least, Nicole Beersworth, South African political scientist, also has been doing research on Zimbabwe. And of course, our very able moderator, Violet Gonda, who will take us through the conversation. Violet.
Thank you, Dr. Mandaza, and hello and welcome to viewers in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the rest of the world. As Dr. Mandaza said, this is the fourth in the SAPES Trust Policy Dialogue series on Zimbabwe's deepening crisis, and we are looking at what we have to do now. The theme today is South Africa's policy towards Zimbabwe, and the fundamental questions we'll be asking are, why doesn't South Africa use its clout and influence to stabilize a country of such importance in SADC? And also, how does one make sense of South Africa's posture? As usual, we are live streaming on the SAPES Facebook page, and participants watching on Zoom can type questions for our speakers right here, or raise your hands during the open forum later in the program. We will start with presentations from our main panelists, followed by a question and answer segment, and then contributions from a number of selected discussants. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Elizabeth Sideropoulos, who is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Violet, and thanks again to IBO for proposing this collaboration on a topic that certainly in my career at SIRE has constantly been one of the issues that that we have focused on. And thank you also for a very provocative title, IBO. In terms of the discussion and really unpacking what each dimension of that means. What I thought I would do with my opening remarks, and I'm sure then Violet can dig away afterwards with her questions, is really to look a little bit at where we've come from, but that isn't really the focus. Rather to actually look at what we can do at this juncture. In terms of, and I mean here South Africa. Historically, South Africa's focus in its engagement with Zimbabwe, and I think Violet, you've posed some very good questions here, which I will be addressing to some extent. South Africa's focus has been on stability over democracy or better governance. So it's about making sure that the state remains stable, and we can argue whether that has been successful. And it has done that often as a trade-off to sort of pushing for greater opening up of the democratic space, greater accountability, etc. And I think it has made some substantial inputs over the last, particularly during the Mbeki years, but I think it failed really to see them through. And I think perhaps the GPA and the GNU are good examples of that. I do believe that at this particular juncture, we need to engage on this issue with substantial resources. And I say that bearing in mind that at this particular juncture, I think the bandwidth of South Africa is particularly strained. It's strained both from a financial perspective, but also in terms of what's happening with COVID, and clearly what is happening domestically after 9 years of state capture. But I do believe that actually it is in our interests to have a working democratic Zimbabwe as our neighbor, and that therefore we have to invest in that. And that, so there is an interest dimension to it, but I would argue there is a value dimension to it, and the issue about values here is that certainly in the last couple of years under the Ramaphosa administration and the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, there has been an attempt, certainly at least in word, to emphasize that values have to be an important element of our foreign policy, that we have to recapture the moral high ground that we lost a long time ago, and that we have to give space also to a human rights dimension to our foreign policy. All of these things, of course, are not mutually exclusive, but there has been that emphasis. Now let's just look at a little bit of where we are in Zimbabwe. As I indicated, in terms of my particular career at SAIA, the crisis is now 20 years old. I think SAIA has been engaging with this in very many different fora and in different ways over that entire period. In this period, the economic and social crisis continues. Governance institutions and the rule of law continue to be undermined and to have been significantly eroded. There is a political impasse between the main political protagonists and has been for some time. People have voted with their feet and trust in the body politic has eroded. The 2008 global political agreement in the GNU were in retrospect simply an interregnum that in 2013 returned to the polarization, fragmentation, all of the governance issues that were never really resolved in that period and that characterized the preceding period. And the change of guard in 2017 was seen by many as carrying the potential of turning a new page, but absent a willingness to address the political and governance challenges, including the vested interests of the ruling elite, including the military, the crisis continues and is being exacerbated by COVID. So this is clearly, you know, we got to do something. We got to do something differently, I think, because this has, as I've indicated, this is not something that actually is in the interest of South Africa, notwithstanding that we have gained skills and so on, and it's certainly not in the interest of a region, particularly at a time when we're talking about greater, more effective regional integration in the context of the continental free trade area. Now, over the years, South Africa has spent a lot of time on Zimbabwe as SADC's mediator. If we look at where we are today, we can argue clearly that it's not been effective. Perhaps its crowning achievement was the GPA in 2008. But then keeping ZANU to the GNU and the GPA commitments, after that, things frizzled away. And with the elections in 2013, I think South Africa almost, you know, and SADC sort of stepped away and said, well, our job's done. In retrospect, none of the deep structural problems were addressed fundamentally. And if we look at the most recent IMF Article 4 consultations report, that indicates that efforts were made in 2019 to tighten, from the government's perspective, some of the fiscal dimensions, but actually the report noted that the staff monitored program was off track. So the economic dimension was not happening. The significant governance reforms were not happening. And they were concerned, of course, that with the onset of COVID, this economic and humanitarian crisis would be exacerbated, and had already been exacerbated by policy missteps and climate-related shocks. And it would really require difficult policy choices from the authorities and support from the international community. And I quote this because they also made the point quite strongly that there is a need to address governance and corruption challenges, entrenched vested interests, and enforcement of the rule of law to improve the business climate and support private sector-led inclusive growth. Such efforts must be instrumental, would be instrumental to advance re-engagement efforts with the international community and mobilize needed support. And that's where I'm sort of, if you were seeing my written document, I said emphasis added by me. And I make that point because, of course, on the other side of the equation, both South Africa and SADC have over the last several months made calls for the immediate lifting of sanctions, first in August at the SADC meeting last year. Most recently, President Ramaphosa in April made that point, also called for the lifting of sanctions in the broader context of COVID, and he also called for the sanctions to be lifted in the case of Sudan. So there's been a focus on getting sanctions lifted, more so now under COVID, in order to create more fiscal space for Zimbabwe to be able to deal with this, as indeed it's a challenge that we're all facing. But the truth is that unless significant changes are made, and this is not about tinkering with policy, but actually significant reform changes are made in terms of the overall governance and rule of law, that is not going to the rest of the international community is not going to respond to that call for removing sanctions. And I think that must be clear. So we're at an impasse. For sanctions to be lifted, Zimbabwe will have to undertake both political and economic reforms, but such reforms are also integral to the country's overcoming of its 2-decade-long crisis. So the country needs a new social and political compact, but fundamentally the politics have to be addressed first, that we can't simply be tinkering with the economy and thinking that somehow it's all going to kind of pull together. And I say that because I think this is important also for us as South Africans to realize and to take into account. I think in November last year, our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, actually made some important observations in terms of the Zimbabwe situation. Firstly, she said that South Africa should not be arrogant, that it had the solutions to the problems. And I think that's an important, it's an important point to put out there. So yes, we are the bigger neighbor, but we don't necessarily know all the answers. Can we exert more influence? Yes, but we don't necessarily have all the answers. The solution clearly lies with the Zimbabwean people, or at least Zimbabwean people have to be integral to a process that could be facilitated by external actors, but they need to be at the very center of it. She went on to say that it seems clear that even as we support the call for an end to economic sanctions, the political dynamics are inextricably linked to the economic, and thus should be confronted simultaneously. We may have to devise innovative forms, she goes on to say, of institutional collaboration that would help sustain and perhaps restore the efficacy of critical institutions. Okay, so that I think is important. It's recognizing that actually something has to give, something has to change. So the question now is, how can South Africa help, and does it have the bandwidth or the resources? As I indicated earlier, South Africa has an interest in a stable and prosperous Zimbabwe, but it should now be clear that this is not possible without real and lasting reforms. So we can't sort of begin a process and then back away without continuing to put the requisite pressure on the parties to see these reforms through. These reforms will, by definition, if they are done properly and efficaciously, reduce the political and economic power of vested interests. And here, we're talking about ZANU-PF as a party, and we're also talking about the military. This means there needs to be a genuine desire from all sides in Zimbabwe to resolve the crisis once and for all. The question here is, are all the parties ready for such an engagement? If they are ready, what should we do as South Africa? Well, again, I think South Africa should not be arrogant about what we think we can achieve, but equally, we should believe that we can play an active role in helping Zimbabwe. And I think in the last few years, particularly post-2013, I think we have taken our foot off the pedal. Zimbabwe, unlike Libya, does not have to contend with a whole host of external players wanting to exert influence and advance their interests. This does actually make it easier for a meaningful engagement with the parties from South Africa, by South Africa, and indeed by SADC. I mean, yesterday I was in a discussion on the external actors in Libya, and to really try to unravel that situation is a complete nightmare, and I can't see much light at the end of the tunnel in the short term. But Zimbabwe is not that, and I think we can be thankful for that. And so this meaningful engagement, and again, you know, South Africa has had various meaningful engagements, but at the time focused on quiet diplomacy, focused on recognizing that we can't push too much because we respect the principle of non-interference in the affairs of another state. We also have sort of concerns. I think the government at the time did have concerns about the rise of a trade union movement and what that might mean if there was regime change. But the fact is we need to actually reopen the way in which we've engaged with Zimbabwe. And at this point, it does have to be tentative. Because I think it's really about testing and seeing how we can build consensus for a process that brings all the parties back to the table again. So this is not about saying you have to do this, you have to do that, but it's about really beginning a process, a series of informal discussions with all the parties individually, but not just government, including the MDC, including civil society formations. I know that many of these civil society organizations often battle to get appointments at DIRCO. I know because they come through Joburg, they come through Pretoria, and we often have discussions with them, and they battle to actually get a hearing. And I think that's a problem. There seems to be a discomfort among the South African government officials to engage meaningfully with the sector outside government. We should make it easier to help inform our thinking about how to resolve this long-standing impasse. There also needs to be hard discussions with ZANU and the military. South Africa can certainly play a role in helping to remove sanctions, but it can only be successful if there is meaningful change. If it has something to put on the table in its engagements and its negotiations or discussions with, not negotiations, discussions with the international community. The external community will not do anything unless it sees significant changes in the way Zimbabwe is governed. And so here there could be a sort of I don't want to use the word symbiotic, but an interlinked relationship that actually helps to advance both better governance as well as then addressing the external environment and the sanctions. The objective would be to bring all the parties together around the table at a later stage with the informal engagements intended to lay the foundation, because currently the climate is not there. Second, and I've made that point and I'll make it very quickly, South Africa really doesn't have the resources that it had in the early 2000s. It cannot provide any financial assistance or use that kind of assistance as an incentive. And COVID, I think, has made that even more problematic. The most recent figures show that we've lost 3 million jobs in the last few months. But I believe that putting resources into helping Zimbabweans overcome their impasse and the economic and political malaise is an investment worth making. If there is one foreign policy priority we should have, it should actually be Zimbabwe. If Zimbabwe is able to resuscitate its economy, which is based obviously on sorting out its political issues, it can become an important partner for South Africa in the building of a regional economic community based on regional value chains, an important building block for the achievement of the continental free trade area. And a resolution of the crisis in Zimbabwe becomes all the more important from a South African perspective in light of developments in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. We don't want, and we cannot afford to have another neighboring country descend into significant instability, and Zimbabwe still remains this gaping hole in what, from an economic perspective, and what can really, should ideally be a key player in the economic development of the region. Which is why really pushing, and here just my last remarks, really pushing for sincere dialogue and recognition, especially from the ruling elite of the need to make changes in opening up the civic space, fighting corruption, re-establishing independent institutions are vital. And this is where I think South Africa really has to exert its influence. And it doesn't have to be about shouting, absolutely, but it does actually have to re-engage at a senior level with both the government and then with the other actors. The fact is that Emmerson Mnangagwa has not brought about a sustainable spring. So something has to give and to change. And South Africa can play a midwife role in that. Otherwise, I think we will be discussing this again in 2030. So I cannot emphasize enough that the parties inside Zimbabwe need to be at the point that they can recognize that this is necessary, and that from our perspective, from the South African perspective, we are willing to engage. Not just, by the way, at a governmental level, but let's look at this in a multifaceted way, which uses all South African actors at its disposal in an integrated, coordinated way. So it could be the ANC, the think tanks, CSOs, business and the churches, taking advantage of the different leverage points that different actors may have with partners in Zimbabwe. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Just a couple of questions for you. on the issue of South Africa is ready to intervene or come and help the key players in the country, what happens if they don't actually sit down and talk? Because at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest problems that we've seen in Zimbabwe, where the political parties are failing to sit and talk. So does South Africa have to wait for Zimbabweans to actually do something before it can intervene?
No, I think it has to actively engage with all the parties to get them to a point where they need to recognize that they have to be at the table. And I use an example, and I know this is, it can be a hard slog, but I use the example of how the process began in South Africa in the late 1980s. I mean, in 85, 86, the National Party government wasn't going to sit down and have any conversations with anybody. But there was a series of engagements, even before we got to 1990 and 91. And I'm hoping that it doesn't take that long. There were a series of engagements of of various non-state actors with the informal hidden involvement also of some actors in government who believed actually that some conversations needed to begin. To get us to where we got to on the 2nd of February 1990, where F.W. de Klerk announced this. Now, I'm not drawing parallels between the two, but I'm using that as an example of how do you break impasses, or how do you make people appreciate that they need to come to the table. And perhaps COVID is an opportunity, because COVID's implications, I think, for the region as a whole are going to be significant, and they're going to go beyond sort of the next 3 months. They're going to be really, really significant. And so this crisis perhaps will make us focus our minds, both in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, that actually we cannot afford not to be sorting this out, not to be sitting down at the table and trying to get out of this vicious cycle that we've been in for 20 years. I mean, that's the message.
And we've seen what's been happening in Mali, for example, and we've seen Western governments coming in to mediate in regional crisis. But in SADC, in the Southern African region, we hardly see any movements. Why is that? Why do SADC governments let things get worse before they actually, can do something about it?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that it's a good thing necessarily to have, say, French involved or British involved in the mediation in Southern Africa. And we've had we know how also the UK engaged on some of these issues, both more recently and in the past. I think I think part of the inhibition is that we don't want to upset our fellow leaders, and I mean all of us in the region. I don't mean specifically South Africa. We're always very, very careful about getting people, calling leaders out. We see that also in the context of the African peer review mechanism, and my colleague Steve is in a much better position to talk about it there. We're also very careful about not sort of bruising egos. And I think maybe sometimes we actually need to bruise egos. They need to be bruised. And so we kind of have this delicate dancing act around, maybe you can do this and maybe you can do that. And that's important. That's part of the process. But at some point, you actually have to recognize that this doesn't work now. And you actually have to now really make use of your influence as in the case of South Africa, as the bigger economy, as the bigger power. But I think you also have to do that in a way that brings the internal parties along, because we have too many experiences of the fact that you go in there, you think you know what is best, and then you leave, and the problem then is left with the citizens. And it's not the case of you make the problem, you earn it, you can leave. And I think that's also something that I think South Africa has been extremely conscious of. But I think historically, South Africa has not wanted to call out any leader in SADC. And that, I think, has been the SADC modus operandi.
Okay. No, thanks, Elizabeth. We'll come back to you again later. Let's now go to Linda Freeman, who's an African political economist, and she's actually written a book on South Africa and Zimbabwe relations. Linda, what does your book say about the topic before us?
Well, it's still in the process, so it's not a has written, but is writing.
Ah.
And I think that first, let me start by thanking IBO and SAPES for including me in this talk. I think I'll learn as much as I'll offer, but I'll step back from what Elizabeth has done and offer a slightly different background look at why the present is the way it is. And IBO started by talking about the South African support of the Mugabe and Mnangagwa government so soon after the end of apartheid as paradoxical, and I would agree. And I think one has to look back to the 90s to get some sense of the orientation which set the South African government up in the 2000s. There were three cases. One, of course, was Nigeria, where Mandela was humiliated when Abacha executed Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogonis. The second was the military bungle in Lesotho, and the third was the debate in SADC over intervention in the DRC. And from this, three lessons were taken. And the first was never stray out of the African consensus. And I think that's what Elizabeth was talking just a minute ago about. The second was never even to begin to consider taking on the Zimbabwean military. They did so badly against the Lesotho military that obviously that wasn't on the table. And the third was at all costs to avoid getting into a quagmire like Zimbabwe did in the DRC. And I think that predilected Mbeki to take the approach that he did. Now, he was centrally concerned with supporting fellow liberation movements all over the region, but particularly in ZANU-PF, even though they'd had a rocky relationship for 2 decades after apartheid. And I think that much revision of history ensued, but nevertheless, that was the commitment that Mbeki talked about over and over again in his ANC Today articles. And so I think we have to take it seriously. And in service of that, he abandoned the moral approach of South Africa's early years, the Mandela years, which he hadn't agreed with anyway, even though it cost him Western backing for NEPAD and also his desire to be the voice for Africa. That clearly went into the ditch in the early 2000s on this issue. So in terms of the options which were given for us to consider in the forum today, I would agree with tail wagging the dog. Mugabe regarded Mbeki as his junior. Mbeki always went up to Harare for discussions, whereas in the past, in the old apartheid days, Ian Smith was summoned to Pretoria. I think the difference is symbolic, but it said something. Mugabe regarded Mbeki as his junior. He reneged on agreements that he made with Mbeki. The airplane would hardly be in the air before Mugabe disavowed everything he'd agreed to. He made a fool of Mbeki over and over again, and Mbeki did not use the tools that he had available. He accepted it, and it was almost like the vision of a battered wife in an abusive relationship. Certainly, given the effort which Mbeki put into finding a solution, you can't call his approach a product of indifference. The intensity of his effort, however misguided and fruitless, does command respect. And I think more so than any of his successors as South African president. As to incapacity, I don't think so. I think the general approach which was adopted was what limited the options for the South African government. And the final option, the economic benefit for South Africa of Zim's economic woes, with the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy, obviously some industries in South Africa benefited, the retail sector, manufacturing, agriculture, mining plowed ahead as it always had. However, I think that if you look at the climate for business in Zimbabwe, ranked in some years as the fastest shrinking economy in the world, it was hardly enough to drive South African government policy. at least in the short and medium term. And price controls, the prospect of indigenization, the absence of the rule of law and property rights, all of these things heightened the precarious nature of doing business in Zimbabwe for South African firms. Operating in an economy where power and fuel shortages and foreign currency shortages and inflation limited the possibilities for growth. So I guess my conclusion on this one is that South African corporations took advantage of the opportunities presented by the crisis, but they'd have done even better had Zimbabwe stayed on an even keel. Generally, as Zimbabwe had been Southern Africa's second most diversified economy, its economic decline in the 2000s has had a major negative impact on South Africa and the region. So I think that we can put to rest the notion that this was a sort of conspiratorial effort of South African capital to reap benefits out of a collapsing economy. Some did, but I don't think as a whole it drove policy or has been all that great. I mean, people who had farms and wildlife conservancies, they were taken over, expropriated in some cases, and are still fighting for their property. The larger question of why the South African government didn't use its clout and influence to stabilize a country of such importance in SADC, I think Elizabeth's already covered this. In the Mbeki period, the government stated over and over again that Zimbabweans could solve their problems while at the same time, they provided substantive backing for the ZANU-PF government and adopted a patronizing and dismissive attitude to the opposition. So this notion of keeping hands off was a bit of a smokescreen. None of Mbeki's successors has deviated from this position, not Motlanthe, nor Zuma, nor Ramaphosa. They all have made very clear where their loyalties lies. There's never been much follow through. If you think of after Motlanthe's report, zero was done. Why is Pretoria unable or unwilling to put pressure on the regime in Harare in terms of democracy, in terms of the integrity of its finances and resources and so on? I think, unkind as this may seem from an outsider, and I apologize if I'm stepping on toes here, but after Zuma, one may say that the South African government under Ramaphosa is struggling to put its own house in order on all of these fronts. The larger conclusion, which I'll end with, without exception, is that the dominant position of liberation movements in power in Southern Africa, and I say this as someone who spent most of her personal and political life supporting them in earlier decades, have proved both Lord Acton and George Orwell right. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely, and the parable of Animal Farm has been borne out by history. Hence the tentative title of my book on South African Zimbabwe, The Albatross of History. Thank you.
That's very interesting, Linda. And already we are receiving quite a lot of comments online and offline. And one that I've just received on WhatsApp says, what kind of regime does South Africa see in Zimbabwe? Some of us see a military regime with a civilian face linked directly to the November 2017 coup. The fact that South Africa and other actors approved of the coup was a mistake. Do you think so? And also they're going to say they can't help to resolve the crisis in Zimbabwe unless they identify the type of regime they are dealing with. What can you say about this?
Well, I think that's true. And Ibo is the expert on this. He called Zimbabwe the securocratic state. And I think that there's no question that the fact that Mnangagwa came down to South Africa and was in discussion with senior people in South Africa before he returned in triumph to lead the government. I think as long as you have that military and ZANU-PF alliance, however shaky it is, you know, one could see future coups coming up. I think that talk of a transformation and a kind of very important conversations that Elizabeth was talking about with civil society, with the opposition, which although I think over and over again it's shown to, in the past, definitely, if one looks at elections like the one in 2002 without question, had the majority support, are treated as well, they're dismissed as not being quite up to par, that they shouldn't be at the table. They're certainly not given consideration. In those early years, Mrs. Dlamini Zuma, even Mbeki, Jacob Zuma would come to Zimbabwe saying they were negotiating, and the MDC would hear about it on the radio. So they've never been treated properly. And I think one has to understand that underneath everything that's going on, there is a certain kind of regime in Zimbabwe, which, and a certain kind of regime in South Africa. Not a military one, thankfully, in South Africa, but certainly a regime in Zimbabwe, which has, right from the get-go, had the military at the core of power, in the seat of power.
And you heard Elizabeth saying that South Africa needs to have a hard discussion with ZANU-PF and the military. Now, just going back to what happened in 2017, did the failure to call the military-assisted transition mean a lost opportunity for strong international diplomatic intervention and lose an opportunity to reform the Zimbabwe state permanently?
Well, at that point, I don't think anybody outside had all that many options. The military were in power, and I doubt that anybody could have done anything about it. And that's the worry for the future, is with the extraordinary power of the military, what is the future going to bring? They're certainly not all that happy with Mnangagwa, if one thinks of the way in which they themselves unilaterally took decisions about the country's finances in the last few weeks. So there are signals of unsteadiness. And I'm not sure that South Africa could do much about it at that level. I always thought it was a shame that Mbeki, right at the beginning, hadn't done what he could have done. He had all the levers of power. If one looks back at the way the apartheid regime dealt with Ian Smith, if Ian Smith didn't do what the government in South Africa wanted him to do, they would pull some refrigerated cars, they would halt traffic, they would pull military assistance. And Smith came into line. In a sense, the regime in Rhodesia ended in Pretoria when Vorster and others said time's up. Mbeki had all those levers of power, but never even considered using them. These were liberation brothers, and it was out of the question. And had he had the foresight and the strength and the unity within his government, I'm not sure he would have had. He could have done something right at the start. After that, in a sense, there is a tide in the affairs of man, and they missed it. And so all the shallows and miseries we've seen in the decades since.
I actually wanted to ask you a final question about that, but going back to the time of Gukurahundi, and I wanted to find out, what do you think South Africa should have done at these major historical points in Zimbabwe, from the Gukurahundi, the land reform, and subsequent elections, just briefly? Well,
the Gukurahundi, the ANC was in the region, it wasn't in power. So obviously, the sad thing about that was that the ANC kept its mouth shut then and after. They were, in a sense, dependent on South Africa not invading Zimbabwe. They did, as Eleanor Sisulu has pointed out, they never really did their part. Land reform, well, that all was kicked off in the early 2000s, and Mbeki's equivocation, I think he felt was necessary, but I think it was open sesame for what happened afterwards.
And I think this is a question that has come from Facebook. It's John Foster eventually pushed Ian Smith to the negotiating table that led to independence. Why has Ramaphosa not done the same with Mnangagwa? Will we ever have frontline states to assist Zimbabweans who are now standing alone against an armed and militarized government?
The dismal answer is, that they wouldn't. And they defended their choice. I mean, Mbeki was very, very clear. He was in alliance. He kept defending this policy of talking till the cows come home, and indulging Mugabe when he had all the levers of power, but they were new in power. I think that's part of the story too. They didn't use what they had. They didn't have the strength and foresight. And I think it's a rare leader who has the intelligence and the strength to do that, to take that major step, and as he didn't, then the rest followed.
Okay, I'll come back to you again. Let me just move on to Tendai Dumbuchena. Hi, Tendai. Are you online?
Yes.
Yeah, now Tendai Dumbuchena is a journalist and political analyst based in South Africa. He's going to be talking about the lack of political will. Tendai?
Thank you, Violet. Thank you, Dr. Mandaza and the SAPES Trust for providing this platform for this very important dialogue, exchange of views. I will be brief and answer the questions posed in the subject matter. Is it a case of the tail wagging the dog? Yes, it is. I'm glad that Linda referred to the relationship between Mugabe and Thabo Mbeki, with Mugabe seeing Mbeki as junior. If I can shed a bit of light on that relationship and what made Mbeki almost grovel to Mugabe. You'll recall that in 2002, the 2002 presidential election, the Commonwealth decided to send an observer mission, which produced a report that was very damning. Now, the agreement the Commonwealth leaders had made was that they will be guided to what they do by the report. So the troika of Thabo Mbeki, I think Obasanjo and John Howard, the Australian Prime Minister, were to meet in London to make a decision on the matter, whether to suspend Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth or not. Now, what happened between the election and that meeting is that Thabo Mbeki promised Mugabe that he would veto any decision by the Troika to suspend Zimbabwe, because the decision had to be unanimous. So he went to London, and when he got to London, on the morning of his arrival, Tony Blair's close friend, Peter Mandelson, had written a letter in one of the British papers to say that if the Africans, i.e. Obasanjo and Mbeki, vote against the suspension of Zimbabwe, Thabo Mbeki might as well, Thabo Mbeki's NIPAD, which was going to sell to the G20 in Canada, would be dead in the water. And so Mbeki was then forced to vote with the two other leaders for a suspension. So after that, Mbeki felt that he owed Mugabe a lot, and he and his foreign minister, Nkosazana, groveled quite a bit to restore the relationship. I thought I would just make that point. Is it indifference? No, it's not. It's complicity. Is it sheer incapacity? No, it is not. Is it harvesting on a neighbor's economic woes? I agree with the other panelists that that is not the case. But the main point I wish to make, which answers all questions posed, is that South Africa has no will to provide leadership in SADC, let alone the rest of Africa. This is despite the fact that its economic output is more than that of the other 13 SADC member countries combined. The ANC belongs to what is called the former liberation movements of Southern Africa, which comprises the MPLA, Frelimo, Chama Mapinduzi, SWAPO, and ZANU-PF. This solidarity group alleges ad nauseum that imperialist forces are bent on sponsoring regime change in their countries. They seek to support one another to repel these imperialist machinations and ensure that they govern in perpetuity. The ANC's support for ZANU-PF must beyond their bilateral relations, be also seen within the wider context of this Solidarity Alliance. So the ANC's posture on Zimbabwe is predicated on its policy to support a sister liberation movement in that country. If I may just make this point, South Africa's unwillingness to provide regional leadership is not just confined to Zimbabwe. If you look at Lesotho and Swaziland, these are two small countries almost entirely dependent on South Africa for their economic survival. Lesotho has been bedeviled by chronic political instability, which South Africa has failed to resolve. In the case of Swaziland, despite pleas by the opposition Podemo alliance, South Africa continues to mollycoddle an absolute monarch who denies its people the most basic and human rights. This begs the question, if South Africa is unwilling to use the enormous leverage it has over these two countries to effect change, how can it be expected to do so in Zimbabwe? On the issue of harvesting a neighbor's woes, as I said, I agree with the first two panelists that this is not the case. South Africa does not gain from Zimbabwe's economic woes. There are some private companies that exploit the cheap labor of undocumented Zimbabwean migrants, but it is not in the interest of South Africa for the economic meltdown in Zimbabwe to continue. We must bear in mind that the threat South Africa faces, looking at the future, is that of political instability caused by a shrinking economy and the resultant high unemployment and deep levels of poverty. It is not in the interest of South Africa to have many Zimbabweans in its country competing for jobs and scarce resources with its citizens. It is a situation that will get worse in a post-COVID-19 reality of a contraction of the South African economy. Sadly, with many foreigners embedded in poor South African human settlements, sporadic eruptions of xenophobic violence are inevitable. The ANC is fully aware of the dynamics at play, but cannot summon the political will to have a frank and open discussion with ZANU-PF and other parties in Zimbabwe to resolve the crisis. South Africa has the leverage to do this. There is no lack of capacity. In 1974, the apartheid government used this leverage to force Ian Smith to release black nationalists from detention to open the door to a political settlement based on universal adult suffrage. That leverage still exists, but what is absent is political will on the part of the ANC to use it to nudge ZANU-PF towards a genuine dialogue with all parties to end the crisis. The politics of solidarity seem to trump everything. The current posture of the South African government of Zimbabwe is irrational and inimical to its own interests. South Africa needs Zimbabwe and other African countries to prosper economically, for its companies to trade and invest in a market crucial for its economic expansion. I end there.
Thanks, Tendai. On the issues that you've raised about xenophobia, can you talk a bit more about these issues from a humanitarian point of view, because it appears there are increasing anti-Zimbabwean sentiments as some South Africans feel that Zimbabweans are taking over their jobs. So in particular, what can the South African authorities do about this in terms of the living conditions of Zimbabweans inside South Africa?
Well, it's not the living conditions of Zimbabweans only. It's the living conditions of poor South Africans. If you come to Johannesburg or any of the major metropolitan areas, you see the informal settlements and some very poor sections of the townships. Now, the problem that you have is that in those poor areas which are overcrowded, especially in Gauteng, which are overcrowded, there's so much pressure on the health services, there's so much pressure on finding places for children in schools, there's so much pressure for housing. In those human settlements, those very poor human settlements, you have poor foreigners, the majority of whom are Zimbabweans, embedded in those communities. Right? So that is a very, very dangerous situation. It's a powder keg. And as I think Linda and the previous panelists said, the South African economy is in very bad shape, and things will only get worse because of COVID. And those people, the pressure on those people will even be harsher. That is why I say that the eruption of xenophobic violence is inevitable.
So, but what options does South Africa have in a situation like this?
At the moment,
do you have?
Well, South Africa doesn't have many options because there are no resources to better the lives of these people in the informal settlements and in the townships. The likelihood that the situation will get worse. Municipal governance in South Africa is very, very poor. The levels of corruption are very, very high. So to be honest, there is no way one can be optimistic about the living conditions of those poor people, both South Africans and the foreigners. But what I'm trying to say is that in those situations, the local people will blame the foreigners and hence the violence.
Okay. Thank you, Tendai Dumbuchena. Let me now go to our discussants and start with the Piers Pegu, who's with the International Crisis Group. He's a senior consultant for Southern Africa. Piers, could you start by perhaps talking about the South Africa's foreign policy towards Zimbabwe and linking that with what Elizabeth was talking about earlier?
Well, I mean, I'm wondering, Violet, if we can't look at a bit more of a forward-looking agenda now in terms of what's feasible. And I wanted to leverage off the clear pivot in South Africa's narrative in terms of its foreign policy. In November, with Naledi Pandor making the statement, which effectively pushed a focus on governance and connecting the political with the economic. And I think this is an important shift of intent. This now, of course, has not been translated into any kind of policy position yet. This is something still under discussion within the South African government as they explore ways to see how they can influence and, to use Mr. Dumbuchena's terms, to nudge Zimbabwe forward. Of course, you're not really dealing with an administration in Harare that wants to be nudged forward. You're not dealing with an administration that wants to have a proper conversation about the issues of sanctions and so forth, where South Africa could possibly play a role. So what can they do in this situation? I think one of the big challenges coming out of Zimbabwe is that you have this polarized narrative. On the one hand, with critics internally and externally pointing to reform deficits on multiple levels, and the Zimbabwean government on a regular basis wheeling out claims of progress around reform, these little government matrices that they send off to people and so forth. And there's been no basis for a discussion between the two sides, so to speak, around what reform really means. Now, and that in turn frustrates and adds to the opacity around what developments there really have been on the governance front. The tendency has been to fall back into fairly crude allegations. Nothing's happened, or no, everything is under is being attended to. I think, a useful thing for the South Africans to do right now. And they should also bear in mind that they have a serious credibility issue in Zimbabwe in terms of the concerns that many have as to whether they have been honest brokers in the past. And there is a legacy to that past, sometimes still popping up in terms of how they have been biased in favor of ZANU-PF. Now, there's a series of binational agreements between Zimbabwe and South Africa. These need to be publicized. They need to be clear on exactly what those areas of agreement are that have been put together, 30-odd plus agreements there. And there needs to be this needs to be a framework also for South Africa to examine for itself the extent to which the Zimbabweans are moving on the governance issues that not only Naledi Pandor, but we saw our own Ambassador Mbeki, raising that in the Poland Economic Summit earlier this year. Governance is South Africa's new sort of leitmotif for engaging its foreign policy beyond Zimbabwe as well. And I think governance is the lens which Zimbabweans and others need to attach a range of issues, from human rights issues, institutional integrity issues, and so forth, in order to lock down the focus on these specific issues. Because I think what we've seen with President Mnangagwa and his administration is an endless stream of claims, but no real interrogation of the substantive concerns that have been put on the table by a range of domestic constituencies, echoed by the international community and recently this year by the international financial institutions. Only in this way can we actually have an honest discussion about what's going on. And I think South Africa does have a particular opportunity to facilitate shining the light on these issues. This is something that the Zimbabwean government does not want to do. This is not intervention. This is not a violation of sovereignty. And it's something, of course, which would echo, I think, very strongly with Zimbabwe's own constitutional principles and values. Thank you.
Yeah, but still, going back to my question to you, because I think it's important also, and I think Tendai also touched a bit on liberation solidarity, and I see some comments in the chat room where Martino Chachao says South Africa does not have the will to provide leadership in SADC or in Africa, and they're asking, but why? So can you go back to that question, and also can you tell us about the Kampepe report, which was published later after pressure from NGOs and some people like you, because it's these kinds of things that people then say South Africa is not quite serious about wanting to intervene and stop with the partisan interventions. What can you say about that?
Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, the current situation, we're dealing with a legacy of mistrust and one which is well earned in many respects. If I could deal with that Kampepe issue first, that South Africa, its leadership has been consistently seen to effectively cover up its prejudice and its bias at a number of levels. The Kampepe report, well, it's a report that was written by two judges, former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke and Constitutional Court Judge Sisi Kampepe, who were dispatched to Zimbabwe for the 2002 presidential elections. And they wrote a report to Mr. Mbeki, which effectively said that the election had not been free and fair, contradicting the report of South Africa's own observer mission and SADC's observer mission at the time. And then for the next 12 years, the Mbeki administration and the Zuma administration fought off attempts through the court to access that report by the Mail and Guardian, in fact, who were the lead protagonists on that. And eventually in 2014, South Africa's Constitutional Court ordered the Zuma administration to release that report. And so we can all see it now, and we can see that President Mbeki and President Zuma effectively lied and covered up to the South African public and to the Zimbabwean public. There's been no subsequent explanation from either of those two gentlemen as to why they did that and the consequences of that. On to your earlier question about South Africa's reluctance to move in terms of its foreign policy positions. I mean, this is not unique to the Zimbabwean situation either. It has a position of working through multilateral institutions, whether it seeks the cover of SADC or indeed the AU. It is the term used by many, the reluctant hegemon, unwilling to throw its weight around, but also wanting to be distinctly different from its predecessors that did this. I mean, it was an interesting parallel that Linda raised about Pretoria with the Smith regime and cracking the whip. This is not the approach to foreign policy that South Africans wanted to take on in terms of pushing its weight around. However, sitting on its hands on a number of issues has not been helpful either. I want to recall one anecdote. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, I think this was in the wake of Operation Murambatsvina in 2005, when questioned by journalists when she was foreign minister about why is South Africa not doing anything? And she turned around and said, well, what do you want us to do? Roll in the tanks to Harare? As if the two options on the table were roll in the tanks or quiet diplomacy. Now, there's, of course, a range of different options in terms of messaging, in terms of specific actions that South Africa could have taken. But it has chosen not to do that. It has also chosen to hide behind a notion of liberation solidarity, which is a revisionist position in many ways. And let's also be clear, when the ANC takes a position on something, it doesn't necessarily mean that in its foreign policy, that necessarily extends through to the actions of government. And Swaziland is the key case where the ANC for some time has been pushing for a much harder line by the government on the autocracy in Swaziland. So, you know, these lines are not clear in any way whatsoever, and it does go down to the political will of the key individuals that have taken responsibility for Zimbabwean foreign policy, which has essentially been in the presidency, not adequately inside DIRCO. And I would imagine also unfortunately polluted by some of the political thinking of key individuals within the security and intelligence establishment in South Africa as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Piers. Let me just bring in Dr. Mandaza to just give us a brief comment about this issue of unpublished reports. I understand that there was another report that was done by South Africa, in fact, by the generals, South African generals, which up to now has never been made public. And Dr. Mandaza, I understand that you gave evidence to the Commission of Generals at the South African Embassy at the time, a few years ago. Why has the general's report not yet been made public? What can you tell us about this?
I think it's a scandal. I think it's a scandal along the lines that Piers and Tendai have just outlined. It's more than just cover up. I think it speaks to the incapacity. Tendai says it's not incapacity, it's lack of political will, but that is incapacity. Lack of political will speaks to an incapacity. And I think it has to do with, let's take the general's report. The general's report was prompted by the violence that followed the 2008 elections, especially the violence where 308 people were killed, many were maimed. And I took 3 people, 2 of whom had lost their hands in Bindura in Zimbabwe during the runoff. I took them to the South African Embassy, where I gave evidence to the generals, General Romano. General Romano broke down in tears at what he saw. And he said, I can't believe a liberation movement could do such a thing. And I think, and I was fortunate that I traveled with him back to South Africa. I was going to a meeting in South Africa, so we were on the same flight. And he gave me sight of that report. The report was really detailed. And I think it is those details that shocked Mbeki and his government, especially juxtaposed as it was with the level of inaction, not only inaction, but a level of complicit behavior on the part of Mbeki in particular, in the manner in which he sought to cover up the excesses of the Mugabe regime in 2008, and even cover up of what was a coup, in fact, in 2008, when Mnangagwa and Chiwenga prevailed on Mugabe not to give in to the election results. I think it's well documented. But so I want to say, really, it has to do with either level of arrogance on the part of those in charge of foreign policy at the time in South Africa. And in this regard, I think it is a kind of a fear to confront realities as they are. In private, South African government officials will admit that there is everything wrong in Harare, even at the highest level in South Africa. But they are unable to translate that into a policy. And at some level, it comes to it speaks to a level of almost indifference, hoping that things will wish themselves away. And of course, the level of complicit. I mean, Linda spoke about Zuma meeting Mnangagwa. It's no secret now, the level of complicity of the South African government in the coup in 2017. I hope the analysts at SAIA and elsewhere can do some more work on that. What Piers said just now, I think the level of dominance of foreign policies by the intelligence, the military and intelligence, speaks loudly in our countries, and including South Africa. And I think that's where we should examine more closely to understand what is the intelligence vision of Southern Africa, of South Africa itself, and of Zimbabwe. Because I think at the moment, they are the ones running the show, the intelligence and the military.
Thank you, Dr. Mandela. Thank you. Let me go to Matata Tselu, who is a former executive director of the National Editors Forum. Matata, I also want to just read a comment that's in the chat room from Eleanor Sisulu, who says, worse than the Kampepe report was the report of the generals that Ibo Mandas has just talked about, which was sent by Mbeki after the 2008 runoff. That report of the most horrific human rights violations actually disappeared. So I'm wondering, what has happened to the civil society in South Africa? They pushed for the Kampepe report to be made public. How come this has not been done also when it comes to the general's report? Matata?
Thank you. No, I don't know why the people who have been fighting to get the Kampepe report out have not pushed for the general's report to also be released. But I'd also wanted to just start on a little minor thing, that as much as there is no country called Rhodesia anymore, there is no country called Swaziland anymore. It is Eswatini. Whether we like Mswati, the king and his shenanigans or not, but that is what that country is now called. And I just think it's important that we use the correct terminology when we refer to countries. Mm-hmm. The issue around whether South Africa is incapable of doing anything about Zimbabwe, for me, I think in order for us to understand it, we have to go back to why there was the economic meltdown in Zimbabwe. And that takes us back to Lancaster House, Ibo, where there was that whole agreement that the land redistribution program would be financed by the British after a number of years. When those years were about, the ANC was in discussions with the Boers here, and because the UK was not willing to live up to its commitment to the agreement in Lancaster, the Zimbabwean government was about to start redistributing land irrespective of those agreements at Lancaster. The ANC, through people like Mbeki and Oliver Tambo, were the ones who went to ZANU-PF and said, don't do it now, because you'll scare these guys and these discussions won't go on. Let's finish the discussions and we will see how we can help once we are in power. So when they get into power, of course, all sorts of things happen. But the critical thing is that for the ANC, there was no way they were going to confront Mugabe when Hitler, Hunzwi, and the veterans started going around repossessing land, because they were the ones that said it shouldn't happen way before, when insofar as the ZANU-PF position was concerned, that time was much more conducive for that sort of action to happen rather than 20 years down the line, which is where, as South Africans, we are now. The agreements that were made in this country have not transferred economic power and all sorts of other things to the majority. And the chickens that came home to roost in Zimbabwe 20-something years after liberation are about to arrive home here now. So for me, it is not about incapacity. It's about being checkmated by your own agreements with the likes of Uncle Bob. Yeah.
Right. So, but coming to the present situation right now, and looking at South African policy and what they've done over the years, since especially since the ANC took over, what can you say? What can the South African authorities do, or under what conditions should South Africa consider intervening in the Zimbabwean situation?
I think the South African government has always intervened, but whether that intervention, one, met the expectations of a lot of people, or two, was effective, it's a completely different matter. There is also the internal dynamics within Zimbabwe and within the MDC in particular, and how it was responding to things and fracturing. So when people say the South African government didn't want to meet with the MDC, sometimes you have to say which MDC were they supposed to meet, because at any given time you either had 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4. So the interventions were there, including the provision of for ZESA, for example, to access electricity without necessarily paying for it immediately, just to make sure that the economic situation doesn't really collapse immediately. So there are people who seem to think that maybe the tanks can roll over Beit Bridge into Masvingo and bring a different kind of regime change. It is not going to happen, both for the reasons that Tendai mentioned around the solidarity of liberation movements, but for me, particularly because for the ANC, it is totally compromised, because it is the one that said to ZANU-PF, don't do certain things now because you would scupper our ability to become a government in South Africa.
But does quiet diplomacy require silence about gross human rights violations? And in fact,
No.
to add to that, Eleanor Susulu has written a direct comment for you. She says, Matata, I have doubts about that story you mentioned. The only source of that story seems to be Mbeki. In any case, South Africa did not have to oppose the land distribution. It could have confined itself to opposing human rights violations. What can you say about that?
No, I mean, Illinois is my sister. I don't want to say that she's entitled to her doubts. But that is probably my answer. The question around land for the ANC is a precarious issue, because even here at home, they can't go and do something out there that they would not be able to do here and justify it. That's the reality that confronts them here.
Right. Okay, so let me just go to Zimbabwe for now and see if we can get Dumisani Muleya, who's a Zimbabwean journalist, to give his thoughts on all these issues that we've been talking about. Dumisani?
Hello.
Hi, Dumisani. How are you doing?
No, I'm fine, Violet. How are you?
Good, good. Can your initial thoughts on all that you've been hearing now? You've covered the Zimbabwean crisis for many years, and also, you know, the role that South Africa has had in all this. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, my understanding of this situation, the relations between South Africa and Zimbabwe, I interpret them in the context of how the two states have related with each other historically, and then after freedom and independence, and indeed in the context of interests, in the context of ideals. Previously, during the apartheid era and the colonial era in Zimbabwe, South Africa basically acted on Zimbabwe based on a foreign policy approach, which was largely guided by interest, which was basically realism. It was more realpolitik than anything else. The South African governments of the time, they were more concerned about Rhodesia as a buffer to what they saw as the advance of communism down south. And indeed, they related to Smith on interest. If Smith played ball on certain important foreign policy and political considerations, they were willing to support him. If he didn't, it was always a stick and carrot approach. Then when you then take it into Zimbabwe and South Africa after 94, the approach has changed a great deal because of how the liberation movements related with each other. Of course, I mean, ZANU-PF was not part of the so-called original six. It was ZAPU. ZANU only came in later, at later stages. So at the beginning, it was the authentic six parties that included ZAPU, the PLA, and all these other parties, liberation movements in the region that we know of. But how then Zimbabwe relates to South Africa after 1980 becomes a different story from how apartheid South Africa related to Rhodesia. After 1980, the ANC, which was a ZAPU ally during the struggle, in other words, not the ally of the ruling party in Zimbabwe or the party that won the elections, it then sought to realign itself to the new ruling party in Zimbabwe. In other words, to build a new relations with the ZANU-PF from out of Lusaka. OR Tambo, after Mugabe had won the elections, he sends Thabo Mbeki down to Harare to see Mugabe, to find out if Mugabe was willing to cooperate with the ANC to further the struggle. And of course, Mugabe, seeing that Mbeki was not so much of a senior cadre in the ANC at the time, he then delegates Mnangagwa to deal with him. They try to forge a relationship. But what then happens is that Mugabe was not willing to support the South African struggle beyond political and diplomatic and moral support. He refuses to offer the ANC, the MK, any bases in Zimbabwe. And the relationship is developed within that context. When things started going bad in Zimbabwe, the ANC approach or the South African government approach then becomes an approach that is guided by its own foreign policy premise or ideals, and how it relates to the former liberation movements in the region. First of all, South Africa internally, in terms of its own foreign policy, it is a country that clearly believes in multilateralism. It doesn't believe in unilateral interventions insofar as issues of other states are concerned, unless if it has mandate from multilateral partners. It also wants to be seen as the voice of Africa, to be seen as the new voice of Africa. It has been accommodated in international platforms on that basis. So what it seeks to do is to get consensus insofar as approaching questions, foreign policy questions, complicated ones on its doorstep like Zimbabwe. So that's how South Africa has been proceeding. It has been trying to approach the Zimbabwean question based on consensus, which is different from, for instance, how Foster dealt with Smith. That was unilateral. It was based on idealism, based on interest. South African approach is not based entirely on interest in Zimbabwe. It's based on a mixture of that history of the liberation movement. It is based on its, in a limited way, on its economic and commercial interest. But most importantly, it's based on idealism and ideological considerations. That Zimbabwe is one of those fraternal countries, we're brothers, we're sisters. So how we deal with the question of Zimbabwe must embrace all those considerations. Realism is much down the pecking order when South Africa approaches Zimbabwe. That is why you then see that what the people on the ground, like Zimbabwe, an average Zimbabwean, expecting South Africa to apply a real politic or a realistic approach, a realism-based approach in resolving the Zimbabwean question is not happening. Because South Africa, in terms of its own fundamentals in its foreign policy, they are not rooted in realism in dealing with the questions of foreign policy. They are based more on the ideals and multilateralism. So that is complicated how you match the expectations between the Zimbabweans, what the Zimbabweans want, and what the South Africans can potentially do. And of course, there's also the question of deliverables in terms of capability. Yes, South Africa is a big economy, it has a big army, it has huge capabilities compared to Zimbabwe. But the question is, are those capabilities deliverable in the current context of what its foreign policy premise is and how it approaches the Zimbabwean question? The answer is no. But for Foster versus Smith, it was deliverable because it was about interest and realism. To say, we're just going to deal with the Rhodesia insofar as our survival as the apartheid state was concerned. These are no longer the same concerns. So bringing it up to speed quickly about what is happening. Don't expect South Africa to take a realism-based approach on the Zimbabwean question. Expect South Africa to continue pursuing the Zimbabwean question based on the premise of its current foreign policy. Its current foreign policy is multilateral based, it's ideals based, that is your governance, your human rights, that is your democracy considerations. But it wants consensus around Zimbabwe. South Africa does not want to be seen as imposing its will on the Zimbabwean question. And necessarily that translates in interpretation to lack of will, political will, and other realistic or effective instruments of approach.
So Dumisani, that's what I wanted to ask, that do you think that Zimbabwe is taking advantage of South Africa because Zimbabwe knows that South Africa will do nothing?
Yes, yeah. South Africa it clearly is taking advantage because it understands.
No, Zimbabwe. I'm saying, do you think Zimbabwe is taking advantage because it knows that South Africa will not do much?
Yes, Zimbabwe knows that. It knows that South Africa is not going to do much beyond talking. It knows that Zimbabwe is not going, South Africa is not going to do much beyond persuasion because of those historical issues, because of its economic and commercial interests, and because of the premise of its foreign policy, which is approaching questions like this based on multilateralism and the negotiation and diplomacy. You can look at Sudan, how South Africa approached it. You can look at the Comoros, how South Africa approached it. When it was at the UN, you can look at how it approached questions even far afield as those of Uzbekistan and the Belarus and the Myanmar, Burma. It's the same approach as they are applying to Zimbabwe.
Okay, I'm going to come to Stephen Grust next, but before we do that, I see that there's a lot of chatter about what Matata had said earlier on. Let me just read some of the chats, and then maybe we can ask Dr. Mandaza to briefly come in and give us his views on this Mbeki land issue. Let me just read a bit. Sorry, just bear with me. I can't find the chats.
You may speak to it anyway.
Sorry?
What are you looking for? Can I speak on that issue?
Yeah, Dr. Mandaza, you can go ahead.
I think, as Eleanor Sisulu said, there's no corroboration at all to make his narrative about the land issue in Zimbabwe. In fact, I would go further and say that it's a false narrative. First of all, the Lancaster House agreement, I was there myself as a backroom boy at that time, specified 10 years during which there should be no tinkering with the land question. That ended in 1990. Okay. There was nothing to have stopped us, not even the Lancaster agreement, to us as a government, and I was in government too, to have done something about the land, except one important factor, which was that the nationalists, Mugabe included, did not believe in land reform. I remember Innocent Nkala telling me one day that we dare not give land to our people because they don't know how to farm. Leave the white state to farm. In Shona, you want different Nzara. That was the mood in reality in government. And doesn't explain, for example, why land reform began as so-called began in 2000. The reasons for the land reform beginning in 2000 is well known. It had to do specifically with the defeat of the Constitutional Commission report in February 2000, and the need to retain power. I think Arthur Mtambara and others are writing on Mugabe, and Mugabe is said to have regretted very much having pursued the land reform the manner in which it was done. Not to mention the kind of excesses that there are, the fact that most of the Zimbabwean elites, governing, including Mugabe himself and his family, actually got title deeds for the farms they took from the whites. So it's a whole narrative which has to be really examined. But I just want to say that I think Matata needs to re-examine his sources again. That narrative is not true.
Dr. Mandaza, it appears that there's so many different versions of this story, because Jimmy Adesina wrote in the chat, Julius Nyerere's private secretary confirmed the story that Matata has given. Piers Pogu says, Blessing Miles Tendi backs Mbeki's claim and says it is confirmed by the former general. We await a copy of the interview. Obviously, someone is lying, so we don't know. But anyway, let me go back to what we're discussing today, and I'd like to go to another discussant, Stephen Gruzd, who's the African Governance Foreign Policy Analyst at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Stephen, to what extent can it be argued that in the final analysis, South Africa is more concerned at the obvious economic benefits to itself than to actually resolve, to help end the crisis in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, and thanks to Ibo for inviting Syed to be part of this conversation. You know, I think that South Africa, as Elizabeth and others have said, has got limited bandwidth. I think there's been a kind of benign neglect of Zimbabwe over the years, particularly in the Zuma years after the activism of Mbeki. And, you know, it doesn't make the news like it used to, frankly. But we cannot ignore Zimbabwe. We cannot, our destinies are deeply intertwined. And but to expect tanks to roll over Beit Bridge is not realistic. I remember when the land reform was going on, people said, well, why don't we just switch off the electricity? Well, now we have problems with keeping the lights on here, so I don't think that's an option either. But it's often contrast with the way, for example, Nigeria behaves in ECOWAS. And it was instrumental, for example, in getting Yahya Jammeh to leave power when he lost the election. I think for all the reasons that people have already discussed, the dynamics are so different in Southern Africa, the liberation history, the ties, the rivalry, I think, between South Africa and Zimbabwe, the personal chemistry between leaders or lack thereof. I think that all feeds into this. And you know, I think now in the age of COVID-19 and the real crisis in South Africa, where we were approaching, I'm sure today we've gone over 400,000 cases. Now I think Harare is looking over its border and saying, gee, what's happening in South Africa? We've got to be aware of this, whereas it's always been the other way around.
And is my mic muted? Okay. And Stephen, just in terms of what the international community can do, can you give us your thoughts on the BRICS, for example? You know, Russia and China always blocks at the United Nations when Zimbabwe comes up, when the Zimbabwean issue comes up. How does being a member of BRICS affect South Africa's foreign policy on Zimbabwe?
You know, I think South Africa itself did a bit of defending of Zimbabwe as well. If you remember in 2008, after the elections and with the election violence, South Africa was in its first term sitting on the Security Council, and it did everything in its power to keep Zimbabwe off the agenda. I was in Harare a year ago exactly, and we've just the report from the work that we did has just come out. It's on our website, but I was privileged enough to go and meet Zimbabwean stakeholders and some of the diplomatic community in Harare, and there was so much riding on the 2018 elections that it was almost everybody wanted to give it a stamp of approval and move on. There was Zimbabwe fatigue. And it almost worked until the post-election violence and then the outbreaks of violence in January of 2019. And the international community is not going to move until it sees genuine reform. Somebody put it to me when I was in Harare that, you know, we lack a lot of things in Zimbabwe. We lack petrol, we lack electricity, we lack jobs, but the biggest lack is trust. And almost universally to the people that we spoke to, they talked about the need for this dialogue, for the churches to get involved, for example. The international community would definitely support that. But speaking to ZANU-PF while I was there, a very obvious answer was, well, we won the elections. We won it fair and square. The MDC lost a court case. And why should we talk? Why should we talk? We won. We're in power. And that we don't want to negotiate ourselves out of power. So I think if the situation is worsened, the economic decline hasn't been arrested at all. It's going to get worse under COVID. And one wonders where the bottom is for Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me go to Dr. Nicole Beardsworth, who is a South African political scientist and has done extensive work on Zim-SA relations. Nicole, what should South Africa's policy be?
Oh, that's a really tough question. You know, I think, so the one thing some of my reflections that I wanted to bring up in this is that something that all of the other panelists have kind of glossed over is that there was a very short window in which South Africa, or a particular South African president, took a harder stance on Zimbabwe. And I think we often forget that there was a period early in the Zuma administration where he actually appointed Charles Nkakula and Lindiwe Zulu as his envoys to Zimbabwe, and gave them a fairly strong mandate to push Mugabe and to try to engage further with the MDC. And so there was this period for a couple of years where Zuma's administration took a harder line on Zimbabwe. And I think it's kind of instrumental and important. It provides some important lessons for the current situation, basically, because if you'll remember, so Zuma is taking a harder line on Zimbabwe. Mugabe is particularly unhappy with this. And then Zuma starts to see a domestic insurrection, personally within his own party. So the ANC Youth League, which then was headed by Julius Malema, starts to aggravate against Zuma's leadership and starts to challenge the policy positions of the party. He pushes for land redistribution along the lines of the Zimbabwean example. Malema spends a lot of time in Zimbabwe. He receives 20 head of cattle from Xavier Kasukuwere in 2010. And in 2014, Malema allegedly gets $400,000 from the same minister. And so there were all these suggestions at the time that Mugabe was intentionally fomenting domestic insurrection within the ANC in order to get Zuma to take his foot off the pedal, which ultimately did happen. So Zuma sort of starts to concentrate more on the domestic situation, on the crisis within his party, but also on a broader crisis of legitimacy that starts to bubble up during this time. And then in 2013, he removes Lindiwe Zulu after President Mugabe calls her a street woman. So we kind of see this flip-flop when Zuma becomes more concerned with domestic policy issues and domestic problems. So that's the one lesson. The second lesson from that story is the intransigence of the Zimbabwean state at that point, right? That they appear to be reforming, but there's no substance to the reform. And the third thing that I wanted to mention, as Dumi Moleya already pointed out, is the South African government's commitment to multilateralism. So during this period when Zuma is pushing a bit harder on the Mugabe administration, we also see a kind of a core of support for this approach within SADC, right? So we had Jakaya Kikwete and Ian Khama, both of whom were fed up with the crisis in Zimbabwe and had given a broad mandate to the South African mediators to push hard. So now if we think about what we see currently in Zimbabwe, you know, we see the same kind of thing. We see intransigence in Zimbabwe. We see these attempted changes of the constitution, which we all know are regressive rather than progressive. We're seeing the repeal of POSA and its replacement with equally bad legislation. So there's this attempt to demonstrate reform without the substance of reform. That's the first. And then we don't see the kind of multilateralism that we saw during the Zimbabwe crisis. From within SADC, there's really no commitment to pushing a harder line on Zimbabwe. And so South Africa, in the absence of that multilateral stance, is less likely to want to take a leading position in pushing this. And then the third thing, as has been pointed out by others, and I don't think really needs reinstating, is that, you know, these domestic issues really are fundamental, and South Africa is currently facing, you know, a myriad of crises. Ramaphosa inherited a broken and battered state filled with all kinds of people who opposed him, who had been appointed by his predecessor. And he's still battling that same problem 2 years later. So I think it's very difficult to see at this point how South Africa might pressure Zimbabwe, particularly because we don't currently see a point of pressure. You know, I think if Zimbabweans had gone to the street, or if there was some kind of dialogue process where South Africa could try to sort of influence the process, perhaps we might see a more assertive South African stance. But I think in the absence of multilateralism and all the domestic crises, we don't seem to see anything like that emerging anytime soon. And then it's, you know, finally it comes back to, as many people have said previously, balancing the carrot and the stick, which has always been a question for South Africa-Zimbabwe relations, because the two countries are pretty fundamentally intertwined. And currently South Africa has run out of carrots, and the sticks we have are not very effective, and we're not very committed to using them. So I think for the meantime, we're unlikely to see any major change in this relationship, although, you know, I think it is instrumental to remember what Piers had pointed out about the recent statement by the minister, and hopefully that is borne out.
Thanks, Nicole. And, you know, some have accused South Africa of retreating to safe positions. And I think you outlined that very well. And then currently also, is Ramaphosa unable to handle the Zimbabwean situation because of all the other issues that you've mentioned, or the Zimbabwe situation is just too complex for him?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, as I said, you know, there's no point of pressure really where he can influence any kind of reform process at the moment. It's incredibly complex as it stands. We don't see a strong Zimbabwean opposition that is able to speak with a single voice and advocate for a kind of mediation of the crisis or any kind of change. And of course, we've seen the arrest of Jacob Ngarume, who has been calling for protests, but of course he's also quite a small party. So it's hard to see a way in which Ramaphosa could do this, but at the same time, he is very much under pressure domestically from COVID and a myriad of other crises. And, you know, one of which is potential instability around livelihoods. And the question of xenophobia, which many people have brought up, I think is pretty fundamental to this. You know, it's in South Africa's interests for Zimbabweans to be able to go home and be able to live dignified lives. But at the moment, it's just hard to see how South Africa can influence that process.
Thanks, Nicole. Just to let everyone know, the chat room is open. So please raise your hands if you'd like to contribute directly. So I will take a few calls from Zoom, and then I'll go back to the panelists to just get their final recommendations, because I actually understand that there are some South African government officials in this Zoom call, and they're just here to listen in and to see what recommendations they can take from this discussion. So it'll be good to, as your final words, to just give us, you know, some of your thoughts in terms of what can South Africa realistically do going forward. Let me take a call from DBM. I understand that's Professor David Moore.
That's me, Violet. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And thank you, everybody, for a fascinating display of intellectual rigor and et cetera, et cetera. All protocol observed. I think I'd follow what Nicole said, actually, because I think it leaves Dumasani's perspective in some doubt, because I think there are various times in history where South Africa has tried to intervene in Zimbabwean politics. In some of those cases, one of the speakers mentioned, well, this is one of the reasons why South Africa is not trusted, because they may have tried to split the MDC at times. But I think we can go, let's go to 1998. I think Thabo Mbeki had a big role to play in the land conference, which ended up with nothing happening because the British left. So of course, a lot of what South Africa does is related to anger with Britain, especially with Tony Blair when he was contemplating, well, apparently he asked Thabo Mbeki if he'd have support with military intervention. So that's this sort of anti-imperialist and stupid British policies that get involved in that case. So we have an effort there. And then in 2001, I don't know what happened in 2000 really, about what South Africa tried to do. But in 2001, in July, Thabo Mbeki wrote the most fascinating report to the ANC, where he says, ZANU-PF is now run by the lumpen proletariat. In other words, the war veterans. They bribed people with too much social welfare. This was sort of Mbeki in his knee pad state. And then at the end of that long report, he says, we must have free and fair elections in 2002. And we know what happened in 2002, and that's been discussed. So that was another moment where I don't know what happened. Why, what was that document? Why did it disappear until 2008 when Ben Turok published a revised version? But I think it's interesting that illustrates what Ibu was saying, is that there's a lot of real unhappiness in the region with what's happening in Zimbabwe, but they don't know what to do. Perhaps their hands are tied. Perhaps 2008 is another case where the Simba Makoni party was purportedly supported to a great extent by South Africa. We need to know more about that. We also need to know more about 2008 after the March election, when probably the MDC won by nearly 60% of the vote. And of course, it took 6 weeks to count that vote, so-called count. Apparently at that time, the South African policymakers were basically in sort of a tie. Some people wanted to have a GNU right away. Other people said, no, let's follow the constitution and have a runoff. Those people won that debate. So I understand, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. And the result was the killings and torture and homelessness of many people, many of whom voted for ZANU-PF MPs, but not Mugabe as president. So we know what happened in 2008. Nicole raised the issue of 2013, when Lindiwe Zulu mentioned at the June conference in Maputo that the roadmap wasn't being followed, and then apparently made an offer to the MDC that if the MDC pulled out of the election, the MDC would get support from South Africa. Somebody might be able to comment on that report. People in the MDC I spoke to said that, well, yes, we did get that offer, but a lot of MPs didn't want to give up their seats and who would really trust South Africa to pull SADC into that agreement anyway. So 2013, there was an effort to move things. This is not quiet diplomacy, this is undercover diplomacy. 2018, who knows? I think maybe they'd given up after the coup. Anyway, I think those are kind of historical questions that aren't just historical questions, because if we understood them more and uncovered more about the reality of those moments, we would understand some of the ways in which the policymakers in South Africa have worked in the past, and maybe everybody can learn from that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Moore. Let me go to Chorus Nyamakunda.
Okay, thank you. I'll start my question as a journalist, my first question as a journalist. The South African media as the fourth estate of the realm, what role have they played and what role are they playing in the issue of Zimbabwe? Are they writing fairly? Are they writing incisive, well-researched to influence the people in South Africa? Number two, or especially challenging those reports that have not been released into the public domain. What have they done about it? What have they written about the issues about Zimbabwe? Number two, we are saying here, it's been said here, the South African government is taking certain positions, taking light the issue of xenophobia. When xenophobia happens, it's the people at the grassroots in South Africa are speaking. Is the South African government in tandem with those sentiments, or they are not representing those sentiments? And also the opposition parties in South Africa, what are they saying? What are their views about the issue of Zimbabwe? Number 3, the civic society has been mentioned by one of the churches. During apartheid, we had Desmond Tutu. He was vocal. Where are the other churches? Are there no more bishops or church leaders in South Africa to be speaking about Zimbabwe, to be challenging their own government in South Africa? And I just want to also comment about the lack of opposition party in Zimbabwe. I think it's unfair to say there is no opposition party to negotiate with. I think that's an insult to the Zimbabweans. There is an opposition party. ZANU-PF knows the opposition party. So it's a lame excuse to me to say there's no opposition party to negotiate with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chorus. And I'll just take 2 more from the floor, and then go back to the panelists to respond to that final question about the way forward. Professor David Moye from the University of Johannesburg.
Thank you very much. I would like to just very briefly, I agree with Nicole and David Moore and few other. Let's face it, before we even talk about way forward, the bulk of Zimbabwe's crisis, lies with Zimbabweans, whether we like it or not. I know Becky said this way back, and the criticism leveled against him. There are limitations to what South Africa can do for Zimbabwe. If we have to be fair within SADC itself, South Africa has spent more resources, more than any other SADC country, on Zimbabwe itself. We don't have time to go deep into this. And the idea that it doesn't intervene, the so-called coup or whatever in the military came, South Africa didn't say anything. And all those who had said that South Africa is supporting Mugabe for whatever reason, it doesn't hold water, because when Zimbabweans were on the streets, Pretoria didn't do anything. If it is really indeed true that they fully support Mugabe, they would have done something. Going forward, political parties in Zimbabwe has to be united. They have to speak with one voice. And both Zimbabwe government as well as the ruling party and opposition must speak. The global environment has changed. The 2000 and what's happening globally, there are really no champions for regime change, as well as any other views from the Western world. The appetite, whether in London or anywhere else, is absolutely not there. So the idea that there's someone out there coming to help us, it's not only in the post-1980, even during the colonial era. As Africans, we always thought that there are people out there who will help us. So even among ourselves in the post-Uhuru, yes, neighbors can help, but at the end of the day, Zimbabweans have to resolve their own issues.
Thank you, Prof. Now, the last hand up is from Eleanor Sisulu. Your brief comment, please, Eleanor.
Okay, yes. I would say Zimbabweans would handle their own issues actually very easily if they weren't shot at, if they weren't abused, if they weren't tortured, if their rights were denied, they had a free media, all these things. If a general's reports had been listened to and SADC and had been shared with SADC, then it would have helped Zimbabweans a lot to resolve their own issues. The main thing keeping Zimbabweans down is the military aggression, abuse, torture, by state security agents, and the daily grinding down of ordinary citizens, the fiscal lunacy that prevails, those are the things that are keeping Zimbabweans down. I would say, from a South African point of view, my argument for, or advice, I wish ideally the South African government would take a human rights approach to every single conflict on this continent, not just Zimbabwe. So for example, if you send election observers and they come back with a report, whether it be Malawi or Mozambique or Zimbabwe, and they say this election was not fair, you listen to the report of your observers. You had the SADC Parliamentary Forum. SADC Parliamentary Forum were brilliant observers. They were ignored, and I think in the end, SADC even got rid of them. So I would say South Africa's foreign policy is not based on ideals. And if it was based on ideals, whether Zimbabwe or Cameroon or South Sudan or the Sahel, then it could play a big role in promoting human rights on this continent and resolving conflicts. Okay. And conflicts are not necessarily between two political parties. It's about the rights of citizens. And civil society in South Africa must fight to stop these torturers from being allowed to come here and do shopping. Torturers must be identified, and we must actually raise this thing that don't let these people come here. These are torturers and abusers. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I see Dumisani's hand is up. So what I will do is I will just get final words from all panelists and discussants, but please can you make it brief so that we can hear from everyone. And I think just before we hear from our panelists and our discussants, there's a message from Dr. Alex Magaisa, who says, I'm a bit disappointing that several panelists seem to have brought the ZANU-PF propaganda concerning the absence of an opposition in Zimbabwe. Any serious observer of politics in Zimbabwe knows what the major opposition is, quite apart from the other sideshows. So bear that in mind when you give us your final words. So let me start. Dumisani, I'll come to you, but let me start with Elizabeth, then go to Linda, Tendai, and then we'll get the views from the discussants. Based on what you've all covered today, if we had to advise the South African government, what will be your recommendations regarding the policy on Zimbabwe? Just brief responses, please, as your final words.
Well, I think I've made some observations in my presentation, and also I think just to re-emphasize based on the inputs from everybody else, that at this particular juncture, and I agree actually with all the points that people have raised about how difficult it may be, or how against South Africa's practice in engaging with difficult situations in the region, it might be. I don't think, if we don't want to be having this discussion in 2030, I think South Africa has to lead with using SADC, because I think, that feeds into its point about not doing it unilaterally, but it has to lead. And if you are a leader, and I think certainly there has been a narrative shift, as I like the word that Piers used in South African policy engagement, that we need to lead, and we can't necessarily sit back and wait for things to happen. Much as I think as we have been doing for 20 years, but then we'll be sitting around having the same conversation in 2030. I think South Africa needs to re-engage. It needs to build up its credibility, which is about also listening and being open to other parties in Zimbabwe, not just ZANU-PF, and rebuilding that engagement to actually become possibly some sort of interlocutor that can begin to move the process forward. It's a bit like, a marriage. When the one side and the other side are not talking to each other, sometimes you need somebody to actually come in and intervene. And it doesn't mean intervention, doesn't mean sort of beating people up. It means coming in and actually providing a context and providing an engagement that actually helps the parties to actually move forward, rather than become completely immersed in the way in which they see the world. And I think it's imperative for us, there is an interest dimension, absolutely an interest dimension, and there is a dimension that speaks to South Africa's credibility as a leader in the continent, because I think some of the comments in the chat box are correct. I think South Africa has lost a lot of that, and a lot of its soft power that came with it in the early years.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Linda?
I'd like to just pick up from there and say that to inject a note of caution in that South Africa's involvement has hurt trust, credibility. Its involvement's been lopsided. It supported ZANU-PF. It started to abandon Mugabe in the early 2000s, but it never abandoned its support for ZANU-PF. So I would say, leave with a question: can involvement by its partiality not make things worse? When is the ANC government going to give the opposition the respect it deserves, and civil society, the point that Tony Wheeler's been making on the side? And so far, there's been no sign at all that they're prepared to abandon this absolute root and branch commitment to their allies.
Thanks.
And neither are the other countries in the region.
Mm-hmm. Tendai, and perhaps Tendai, in your response, can you also answer Chorus Nyamkunda's questions about the role of the civil society, churches, and the media, and to see if they can also play a part in terms of helping to put pressure on the South African government? Tendai?
Thank you. I think Nicole, if I understood it correctly, makes a very, very important point. And that is, as things stand, right, there is nothing for South Africa to respond to. There have to be developments in Zimbabwe, whether there are talks going on between parties there, or there are demonstrations, or some sort of activities that refocus the region's attention on Zimbabwe for South Africa and other member states to respond to. In the absence of that, right, Zimbabwe will remain where it is at the moment, which is off the radar, right? Coming to the media and civil society, church leaders here, right? There's very little coverage of Zimbabwe in the mainstream media this time, because A, there's nothing much happening there, and B, South Africa is more inward looking because of the problems that the country faces. And I think that that gentleman you referred to also asked a question about the xenophobia and what the ANC's stand is. The ANC is embarrassed by the xenophobic violence. It has always said to people that its leaders were looked after in African countries during apartheid, and that people must therefore welcome their African brothers and sisters. But of course, the ANC has come to the realization that that message has no resonance at all among its poor followers, and it's an issue that increasingly is focusing their minds. And next year there'll be local government elections. There'll be a new party led by the former mayor of Johannesburg, which will put border controls and immigration as a hot electoral issue.
Okay, let me also just get final comments from the discussants. I'll start with P.S. Pegu, then go to Matata Tsedu, and then Dumisani after that.
Thanks, Violet. You know, as a final comment, I mean, I think that notwithstanding the trajectory that we're on at the moment in Zimbabwe, which looks set to get worse, it's important that South Africa's position is premised on factual realities of what's going on there. And I think South Africa has, to a certain extent, we have an ambassador in Harare at the moment who I think is reflecting openly honestly about a number of concerns there. I don't think South Africa is unaware of the problems. It's a question of how it's going to get traction on a number of these issues. And yes, it does need those hooks from the inside and better organization from Zimbabwe, with perhaps a clearer focus on look south and working the various constituencies, not only in government but civil society here, that would be open to supporting changes in Zimbabwe. I think, you know, you can be sitting here in South Africa and Zimbabwe could be a million miles away. And I think some of the lack of understanding of those issues has been evident in some of the comments that we've heard today. So, you know, I think work can be done, but it's going to be a very slow, painful process. And South Africa's foreign policy needs to be put under the spotlight with respect to these issues and interrogated in a careful but in a constructive way.
Okay, thanks, Piers Pugu. Matata, Sedru? Is Matata still online? You'll have to unmute your mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be very brief and say I think Zimbabweans have to avoid falling into the Palestinian trap, where every time the Jewish state goes on one of its murderous escapades, the call is to the international community, almost as if the Palestinians themselves have nothing that they can do. There's not much, but the whole notion that the international community must do certain things, it's a sense that I'm getting here, that Zimbabweans feel that South Africa must do certain things. The solution to the problems of Zimbabwe essentially lie in the hands of Zimbabweans. And South Africa has a responsibility to assist in any way possible. And that any way possible is indefinable in the absence of whatever may be the situation on the ground at a particular time. And I've seen some of the comments here that people mustn't say there is no opposition. I don't think anybody is saying there is no opposition in Zimbabwe. We're saying it's splintered. And it is important to actually admit to factual realities and not live in some kind of fantasy world. That's me.
Thanks, Matata. Let me go to Stephen.
Two quick things to end on. The first is, and I don't know if it can be done in isolation, but one thing that South Africa could insist on is reform of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, because I think elections are so critical, and there's a lot of, it could be a much more, a stronger body, and that may be something that South Africa can push for. And secondly, there might be an opportunity. Zimbabwe in February this year joined the African peer review mechanism that I've done a lot of work on. Maybe this is an opportunity for civil society and to create that dialogue that is so missing by virtue of the country's membership of that.
Thanks, Stephen Groost. And Dr. Nicole Beardsworth.
Thanks. I think it's been a really robust debate. I guess the thing I wanted to end on is just briefly this critique around Zimbabwe's opposition. And I think it is fair to say that Zimbabwe's opposition is currently speaking with many voices. And in South Africa, as many people have pointed out, the opposition, all opposition parties are no longer using the Zimbabwean question to platform, right? We don't see churches taking on the Zimbabwean question. We don't see anyone in South Africa advocating on the Zimbabwean question. So I guess what I would quite like to see is the Zimbabwean opposition coming together like it did in the 2008 crisis, where it spoke with a single voice. They had joint press briefings, they sent delegations to SADC, they sent delegations to South African opposition parties, and get Zimbabwe back on the agenda. Only when it starts to look like it might hurt the ANC will we see the party taking a stronger line on Zimbabwe.
Thanks, Nicole. And finally, from panel discussants, Dumisani Muleya in Zimbabwe. Dumisani, you have to unmute your mic.
All right, okay. Hi, Violet. I wanted to just conclude by saying that starting with South Africa, then coming back to Zimbabwe, South Africa must realize that it has geopolitical responsibilities on the Zimbabwean question. Nobody is saying that the Zimbabwean question is an exclusive responsibility for the South African government. What people are saying that geopolitically, South Africa must understand that it cannot sit around a problem and sketch it around it, and in fact intervene negatively by supporting the oppressor, by supporting the authoritarian regime. That's what people are saying. If South Africa is to play a positive role, it must stop siding with the authoritarian regime in Harare. That's one. Number two, South Africa needs to understand that Zimbabwe is no longer a foreign policy issue to itself. It's now a domestic issue for South Africa, primarily because there are millions of Zimbabweans who have migrated to South Africa because of the collapse in Zimbabwe. So that means South Africa must treat the Zimbabwean question as an immediate and urgent issue, because there is no point for South Africans and the South African government to complain about Zimbabweans in South Africa and then go outside of South Africa to support the oppressive regime in Harare. That is a very serious contradiction which cripples its foreign policy. And then the other point is that South Africa needs a quick and a fast foreign policy shift on Zimbabwe to engage with the Zimbabwean question all the time, using all the platforms that it has, that is direct bilateral relations through SADC, through the AU, where President Ramaphosa is currently the chairman. They need to engage immediately with those issues. And then coming to Zimbabweans, Zimbabweans need to understand something very quick and important. A few harsh realities must be brought home here. Frequently, Zimbabweans must understand this. Foreign states will sometimes tolerate and even positively assist some dictatorships around them for various reasons, be they political, be they economic, be they historical, be they ideological. That means Zimbabweans must understand that the struggle is theirs, first and foremost. It cannot be outsourced. It must be fought on the ground by Zimbabweans. So what Zimbabwe needs is a strong internal resistance movement. Right now there's fragmentation, and that is given the regime all the power to manipulate and infiltrate the opposition divided. So Zimbabweans need to reorganize, and this struggle cannot be fought by political parties. Zimbabweans need to quickly understand that. It must be fought by a popular movement which cuts across political parties. Organize people, strengthen them on the ground, make them confront the regime, and that will make it easier for South Africa and other players around to intervene. Without that, with a weak population, with a weak opposition, with a lack of organization and fragmentation on the ground, that will only give the dictatorship in Harare an upper hand. Okay. Those things are not mutually exclusive. They can be done at the same time.
Thank you very much, Dumisani Muleya. We really appreciate your expert opinions on this very important subject matter, and hope that what has come out of this meeting can help guide South Africa's policy on Zimbabwe. I will now hand over to the convener of this program, Dr. Ibo Mandaza, for his final remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Violet. After Dumisani Muleya's summary, do I need to say any more? I think he has just summarized it so well. I can only highlight some of the points they made. I think the first is that the discussion was premised on profound expectations about what South Africa should do. And I hope South Africa will have registered that. There are immense expectations about what South Africa could do, the leverage it has in assisting the Zimbabwean situation. Secondly, there is the issue, as Linda says, of trust and credibility in the manner in which South Africa engages on the Zimbabwean situation. Thirdly, as Tendai indicated, the need for political will. But above all, and I think Matata Machedu made the point, it's us Zimbabweans ourselves who need to get together and form a formidable force to be heard by everybody, on the basis of which we can get support regionally and internationally. And lastly, we forgot to mention that we have, some of us, proposed the National Transition Authority as a way forward, given the impasse, given the dire straits that Zimbabwe finds itself. And we would hope that in terms of foreign policy reactions, not only on the part of South Africa, but also SADC as a whole, but the international media, there is need to get the process moving in Zimbabwe. It is clear to most of us that the government of the day has no capacity to turn things around, none at all. It is very clear from what is happening, this is largely an end game. If we were to preempt the descent into violence, bloodshed in Zimbabwe, there's need to do something now. And those of us who've been pushing the transition authority idea, I think this is the time to engage around it. And we call upon South Africa and the region and the international community to engage and to influence and leverage on the domestic scene towards that kind of outcome. I thank you. And thank you to Misani for the nice summary to the discussion.
And thank you very much, Dr. Ibu Mandaza. And thank you all who joined the event via Zoom and those who have been watching via Facebook. And of course, we will continue with this series. Our next event will be on the 31st of July, where we'll be dissecting the call for mass action. What is the way forward for Zimbabwe? Have a good night.